Taiwan has become one of the most important agenda when it comes to East Asia. Irrespective of what goes around the world, the debate on Taiwan never seems to die down. In recent developments, we see the Chinese military increasing its activities around the Taiwan Strait and even into its defense zone. U.S. and Taiwan's close relations have resulted in an unending power struggle loop between the U.S. and China. This video focuses on questions around Taiwan and its fate as we bring into leading IR experts to analyze what's happening there. On our segment on Taiwan, we have Professor Christopher Hughes, a leading expert on international relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science. We are delighted to have you. So, Professor, to begin with the first question, I'll read out now. A law passed in China allows them to get closer to the Taiwan coast. Simultaneously, the US and Taiwan signed an agreement to push back the Chinese maritime activities around the region. Taiwan Premier Su Cheng-chang mentioned that countries are coming closer in the region because the stability and peace in the region is of utmost priority. How would you explain both China and US's move with regards to the statement that I had mentioned?
Okay, so let me start with Premier Su's statement first, because it's could be a bit misleading on the face of it. Because when he's talking about countries coming closer together in the region, he's not talking about China and the US, of course. He's talking about the US and its allies, especially what's called the Quad. That's China, Japan, Australia, and India. And also Taiwan itself, who are coming together more closely under President Biden to balance China's assertiveness. So what he's saying is that the stability and peace in the region should be an outcome of President Biden's attempt to rebuild the relationships between the US and its friends and allies in the region. So see it in that way, and it makes more sense. As for the law that China's passed, which allows its Coast Guard to use force, use weapons against to defend what they claim as their waters. That's not just aimed at Taiwan, that's also involves the East China Sea, the South China Sea, so Japan, or the Southeast Asian littoral states, all of which have conflicts with China over its territorial claims. So it's a part of China's use of what we call lawfare. I mean, to put it blankly, if China wants to use force, it will use force. It doesn't need to pass a law, really. So this is more of a signal to other countries that we are prepared to use force. So don't mess with us. Don't challenge us. Otherwise, we will use force. And of course, if their Coast Guard uses force, and anyone responds to that, then China can escalate that with their proper navy. So it's a stepping up of China's assertiveness. Now, the US position is now and has been actually since the Obama administration, really, late Obama, and his pivot to the Asia Pacific, or now Indo-Pacific. The US response is to maintain what it calls the status quo by balancing that kind of behavior, by stepping up its own presence in the region, freedom of navigation operations especially, which also includes going through the Taiwan Strait as well as the South China Sea. So you see this build-up of tension, this kind of standoff between the big powers in the region, and China's new law is a part of that escalation, as far as I see it.
All right. Moving on to the next question. In a recent report which made the headlines, Taiwan has committed to buy long-range air missiles from the US. The country has also requested the US to equip it with the most advanced weapons. So do you sense that this could be a game changer for both Taiwan and US to altercate the fate of the Taiwan Strait?
Well, I don't think it's a game changer in as much as it would change the actual position of Taiwan, or fundamentally, for example, leading to US recognition of Taiwan, or something like that. Well, that would be a real game changer. Uh, what it is an attempt again to maintain what the US and Taiwan see as the status quo in the face of China's increasing arms buildup. China's defense expenditure has rocketed over the past 15 years. It's just shooting up. And they have a doctrine of preventing access to the US Navy if there is an emergency over Taiwan, a conflict over Taiwan. All of their resources are there to prevent the US coming in and helping. So that means Taiwan is in a very vulnerable position. And there's always been a question in Taiwan over what kind of a defense posture it should have. Should it just be what some people describe as a porcupine strategy of purely defensive, or should they have an offensive capability? So, for example, if China started attacking Taiwan, they would be able to attack major Chinese cities, perhaps Beijing, Shanghai, or even Chongqing, which would be a deterrent for Taiwan. Now, that is seen by many in Taiwan as the US as a way to deter Chinese aggression. Rather, no one's saying that Taiwan is going to attack China. I mean, that would be crazy, although there may be people in China who think the US is going to attack China. I really don't think that is what anyone is thinking, to be honest. So it is a part of a defensive doctrine for Taiwan that's emerging now and becoming more consolidated in the face of China's arms buildup and China's increasing pressure, military pressure on Taiwan, which has been growing a lot in the last few weeks.
So the next question is that at the recent Raisina dialogue, which took place in India, U.S. commander of the Indo-Pacific, Admiral Philip Davidson, had warned Beijing not to try to change the status quo. As a refute to the admiral's statement, the spokesperson of the Chinese embassy in New Delhi took to the Twitter handle and accused the U.S. of misleading Taiwan. Do you agree that in this war of words between US and China, the true interest of Taiwan is somewhere getting compromised?
Well, I suppose we need to think what are the true interests of Taiwan to answer that question. And the true interests of Taiwan are, of course, the most important interest at the moment is defense against Chinese aggression. So I think what the Admiral Philip Davidson was saying was that it's really China that's threatening that security. And, for the Chinese, their argument is that it's Taiwan that's changed the status quo. Now, there's some truth to that because what is the status quo? The status quo is a set of rules, really, that were put in place by the US and China back in the 1970s when Taiwan was still an authoritarian state. And there was some hope that on the Chinese side that China and the ruling nationalists in Taiwan, who were authoritarians, they would do some kind of deal on unification. Well, since that time, Taiwan has become a thriving democracy. So as Taiwan has changed, that has changed the status quo. It's true because Taiwan's public opinion is now much more important. Taiwan's identity is much more consolidated. And the politics reflects that. There's no point in blaming the president of Taiwan for doing what the voters in Taiwan want her to do, which is to stand up for Taiwan against China. So in a sense, Taiwan's democratization has changed the status quo. But who's going to what's the answer? Stop democracy in Taiwan, or is it for China to somehow change its attitude and policies to become a bit more flexible and allow Taiwan more space? What that would help maintain stability. So talking about stability is better than talking about the status quo. I think it's more accurate because things are always changing in international politics. You can't just stay where you were in the 1970s, which is what they're trying to do with Taiwan. You need to be flexible. So it's probably actually good to change the status quo, but the way China is trying to change the status quo is responding to democracy in Taiwan by threatening it with military force, with economic coercion, with united front tactics, with media war, all kinds of ways to do what they say is maintain the status quo, but actually just leads to more pressure and more friction and more tension and instability.
China's eye for the Indo-Pacific has resulted to an increased attention of the US in the region as well. Would you agree to the statement that the stakeholders here, for say Hong Kong and Taiwan, are stuck in between a power struggle loop without any foreseeable end?
Well, I think that's undoubtedly true, not just for countries in that region, in fact, for the whole world now. I mean, even my own country is stuck between China and the US over questions like, should we have Huawei telecommunications equipment? The US says no, and China says we have to have it. And all of these, that's just one example of many questions that every country has to make now in this competition between China and the US. Of course, that decision is much harder the closer you are to China, because the stakes, the risks are so much bigger, and the expectations of China and the US are much, much higher. Now, that is going to continue, I think, until there's some improvement in China-US relations, which doesn't look very likely at the moment, although we shouldn't discount that, I think. You know, the recent dialogue between the US and China in Alaska looked awful, but, you know, I think there's a lot of theatrics about that. Both sides know they've got to de-escalate this tension. So in doing so, they need to create more space for other third parties, whether it's Hong Kong and Taiwan or the UK or even India. You know, I mean, we've got our own interests, all of us. And they need, both the China and the US need to understand our interests. Hong Kong is the most tragic case where, you know, the Chinese have presented it as a US plot to undermine China when it's not. It's all they're asking for is representative, transparent government in their own territory. You know, there's very few people in Hong Kong were asking for independence until China began to crack down on them. And so by actually increasing the pressure and framing it within this big geopolitical competition has made the situation in Hong Kong much, much worse than it ever needed to be, because, you know, now they're imposing this national security law, which is draconian and alienating all the people in Hong Kong, instead of helping them move forward with some democratic process, which would not be a threat to China, I don't think. And there would be less people would be arguing for independence in Hong Kong if they had proper democratic government. They'd be quite happy with that. So, you know, mixing up geopolitics with other territories or countries' own interests can really actually make things a lot worse. Same with Taiwan. It has its own interests, which are not always aligned with the US. You know, it has trade disputes with the US over meat imports, for example. And that's actually a big issue in Taiwanese politics. And they don't want to be forced to accept American meat imports with some kind of hormone treatment just because of the threat of China. You know, that's not good for anyone. So it's really a shame that these third-party states are becoming trapped in this big superpower competition.
In the summit between US and Japan, which took place recently, we witnessed that there was a united front with regards to Taiwan. China, on the other hand, had warned Japan not to, quote unquote, gang up with the wrong side. What conclusions on Taiwan agenda can be picked from this US-Japan summit?
Well, first of all, this was Biden's first meeting with a foreign leader, and he normally does do that with Japan. It's so important for the US president to see the Japanese prime minister first, because it is so central to the US's own security, the US-Japan alliance. The US-Japan alliance is always quite controversial inside Japan because of the domestic politics, the nature of its constitution, which stops it getting involved in overseas conflicts using force. So it was quite interesting that in that context, the commitment, the mention of Taiwan in that statement was very, very important, because it's the first time that they've mentioned it. They may have mentioned it, I think, in the 70s, but it's certainly the first time in many decades that they've mentioned Taiwan as an issue of joint concern. So that is a powerful message from Japan that they are concerned. On the other hand, Suga has, since then, Prime Minister Suga has said that this doesn't mean that Japan will get involved in a war over Taiwan. And that's because he's faced a lot of domestic criticism for making what appears to be a commitment to join a war on the US's side. So what it means, I think, is looking at Japan's present constitutional situation, which has changed quite a bit under the previous Prime Minister Abe, who allows, the constitution is now interpreted to mean that Japan is allowed to come to the aid of the US in a conflict beyond Japan's territory, which means, of course, Taiwan. So they're allowed to do that according to the law, but politically it would be difficult. So at the moment, what it would mean is that Japan would provide logistical support and probably intelligence support, perhaps even information warfare, jamming technologies, all of these things that Japan is very good at. The question is, what would happen if the US had a war over Taiwan with China and it began to lose that war? Would Japan then just stay out of it, or would Japan get drawn into it? My own feeling is that Japan would have to take more and more of an active role. Eventually, it probably would have to commit forces rather than see the US defeated, and that would mean the withdrawal of the US from the region. It would be devastating for Japan's security. I mean, the loss of Taiwan, which would be a threat to the sea lanes, all kinds of implications. That would be a real game changer. So I think public opinion in Japan would be very important. At the moment, it's very solidly against China. About 90% in recent opinion polls are afraid of China. I remember Japan has its own conflict with China in the East China Sea over the Senkaku Islands. So that's why there's that negative perception, partly. So I think at the moment, Suga is trying to please the US by saying he will help, but keep his own public opinion on board by saying it would only be limited to logistics. What you have to ask is what would happen in an actual crisis situation? Which way would it develop? My own feeling is Japan has the capabilities now, substantial military capabilities, to play a much more active role, and the US would expect it to do that. There'd be intense pressure on them to do so.
All right. So to the last question, Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen's remark on the South China Sea wrapped up with the clauses mentioned in the UNCLOS, whereby she explained that all current elements, including the US, China, and other claimants, must protect the stability in the region. Do you feel that it was a safe option for her and her party, the DPP, to explore that statement, given that South China Sea is very much encoded and engraved to Taiwan's foreign policy?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question because Taiwan has control of one of the islands in the South China Sea, and it's actually quite one of the biggest, maybe the biggest, and has an airstrip on it, which is important. But it's also a real problem for Taiwan, for any government in Taiwan, because they don't really need that, to be honest. In some ways, they'd be better off without that problem of defending that island, which is a long way from Taiwan. It'd be hard to see how they would defend it against a Chinese attack. But they can't give it up, because that would open the government to accusations in domestic politics that they are being soft, they're betraying Taiwan by giving up national territory, and so on, especially from the opposition KMT party, who would make this a big issue and say, and they've done this in the islands in the East China Sea as well, that are controlled by the Diaoyu Islands, the Senkakus, that Taiwan in domestic politics, those are a big issue too, because there are kind of nationalists in Taiwan who say we should protect these islands, they're part of our territory. Now, that's bad for Taiwan's diplomacy because it really is difficult for them to do anything. They don't have the power to do much about these islands that they claim. So I think when you look at President Tsai, what she's doing by appealing to the law of the sea, UNCLOS, is merely saying, let's not have a conflict over this, that all sides need to use the law of the sea to resolve these issues. Now, using the law of the sea, UNCLOS, in the South China Sea is also quite a powerful diplomatic weapon against China, because China's own claims to the South China Sea have been judged to be not in conformity with international law, with UNCLOS, by the independent tribunal in The Hague in 2016, when the Philippines took China to court over its claims in the South China Sea. And there was a long, convincing judgment by the court that China's legal claims don't conform with UNCLOS. So by appealing to UNCLOS, Tsai Ing-wen is kind of sniping at China as well, saying, look, you should obey the law. And that fits in well with the US position on maintaining a rules-based international order. So it's a good diplomatic strategy for President Tsai to try to, first of all, maintain some kind of commitment to the island in the South China Sea, but also send the right diplomatic message that we are the ones who are on the side of maintaining a rules-based order, whereas China is the one that's a threat to the rules-based order.
All right. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I really hope that even in the near future, we get more opportunities to have such interactions with you, which are not only insightful to me, but also to all our viewers. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, and I hope